Okay, so we will be looking at both seasonality and interannual changes in tropical ecosystems. Low seasonality in many tropical forests sort of widens the playing field. Plants and animals can experiment with more diverse strategies than in strictly seasonal climates. So, for instance, when we look at the leaf lifespan, then obviously in temperate zone forests or also in tropical dry forests, the broadleaves are limited to a narrow range of lifespans, while in the rainforest, the leaf lifespans can be anything from a few months in this particular study to about 5 years. And that brings all kinds of trade-offs. We already know from the leaf economic spectrum that the lifespan of the leaf is correlated with lots of other important features of the ecophysiology of the leaf. Likewise, here is the distribution of leaf lifespan for Panama in the understory and in the canopy. So interestingly, there is much broader range in the understory where some of the leaves can be extremely long-living. Panama is a mildly seasonal forest, so there the distribution is more peaked towards shorter lifespan than 12 months, so that the leaves can avoid dry season. Now, the same goes for flowering. There can be very different patterns. These are individual shrubs of different species in Panama, and they're flowering over 12 years, and we can see some different patterns. We can see continual flowering, and then we can see subannual or still quite seasonal annual flowering or supraannual. So that means flowering not every year, and in this one example, only once every 12 years. The same goes for same goes also for individual production of flowers and therefore fruits. This is, again, these are individual shrubs and their production of fruits. This is for Tetragastris, and then this is for Virola. So you can also see that you can have different strategies on individual level. Some individuals can have very peaked production, some can spread it more over a longer period of time. This is showing the same. These are months in columns and years in rows, and heavy flowering is as black dots. So again, we can look, for instance, for certain annual seasonality here with Cassia, September being most favorite months and some months around it. While supraannual in trophies is quite unpredictable, and continual is simply very reliably continual here. So in Hamelis, so different patterns. This is just an interesting photo from a mountain rainforest in Vietnam, where this is a humid forest without any dry season, but there is an Acer maple species coming naturally from the north, from the it's temperate zone genus, and so in the autumn the leaves get yellow and the tree sheds the leaves, although there is no seasonal need for that. So it's an example of a sort of phylogenetical constraint. Now, speaking about the seasonality, we are going to talk about one very important phenomenon, and that's the mast fruiting of dipterocarps. We briefly touch it for the monodominant forests, but here this is a situation where in Borneo, this is the seasonality through several years of rainfall. So it's pretty much raining all the time, although to different degree. And this is the leaf flushing. Again, there is some seasonality, but that's a very continuous activity. But when we look at flowering, then there are huge differences between years, with flowering typically low except for 1976, which was mast flowering and fruiting. The same, another data set here. Again, this is proportion of individuals in the forest flowering and fruiting across different species, and this is proportion of species in the forest flowering and fruiting in different years. So we can see that it's synchronized also on the species level and therefore on the individual level. Dipterocarps produce seeds which are large, rich in energy, and they are poorly chemically protected, and they are wind dispersed. Okay, these are typical features for mast tears by being wind dispersed, which is unusual for tropical seeds. They are not dependent on frugivores, because mast fruiting and flowering makes the seed to escape the seed predators, but of course it would be of little help if it also escaped from dispersers. So that's not the problem here. And because they are oily, then they can be a source of oil, and so they are traditionally collected and exported. So these are the this is the 40 years of export records of the Ilipe nuts, which is Dipterocarp seeds, and the El Niños are marked in red here, starting from 69, when there are good meteorological records, and so you can see that there is a remarkable coincidence between El Niños and mast fruiting. So El Niño, it's not ecophysiological requirement, but it's a signal, because the trees needs to be synchronized across individuals and species, and so El Niño provides a convenient large scale signal for the trees, and it's conveniently unpredictable, so it's hard to adjust by frugivores. So it looks like you can model this temperature and find some clues, but here this analysis found that if there is a rapid drop in night temperature, which is repeated, then it's a cue for mast flowering. Why drop in temperature in El Nino? Because El Nino means no rainfall. That means clear skies. That means there is a low temperature in the night. In La Selva, for instance, which is not a mast fruiting forest in Costa Rica, this is distribution of trees which are flowering continually, subannually, annually, and supraannually. So you can see that subannual is dominant, while in Lambir Hills, which is Dipterocarp forest in Borneo, supraannual, unpredictable mast fruiting and flowering is actually applies to more than half of all trees. There is again similar distribution for Southeast Asian Dipterocarp forest, not only for Dipterocarps but others. This is based by families with number of species in brackets. So general flowering, that means mast flowering, dominant in Dipterocarps, but also other trees in Dipterocarp forest, not anywhere else, are joining. And then you have annual, subannual, and so on. Dipterocarps are still pollinated, unlike mast fruiting temperate zone trees, which are often wind pollinated. Then Dipterocarps are pollinated by insects, and that causes problems, because if you have mast flowering, then you can compete for pollinators. There can be shortage of them. So they developed scattered sequential flowering. So different coexisting species are flowering at slightly different times, which also led insects to escalate their population size, because they can develop quickly, and also divide their attention to different trees. And then with the fruits, they still coincide for most of the time with their fruits. So these are different locations, Sepilok and this one is and Pasok. These are all Borneo locations, and different in this case, shorea trees with scattered flowering, and these are Dipterocarpus species, again with scattered flowering. This is the morphological diversity of the Dipterocarp seeds from different species in Borneo, and there can be of course differences in spatial distribution depending on how far they can disperse in the wind. There are some wingless fruits, and this is example of such a species which clearly shows a very aggregated distribution, unlike another shorea which has a much more efficient dispersal. So likewise, as in a monodominant forest, there are very distinct cohorts of seedlings, which in mast years are then boosting the density of understory seedlings, and then with mortality between mast years, they are decreasing and then boosted again with the mast fruits. After mast flowering, you can see really carpets of Dipterocarp seedlings on the floor. I mentioned the temperate zone. Mast fruiting there is known for a number of trees, conifers, but also oaks, for instance. This is the study of Quercus robur in the UK, and whether the mast fruiting works against the seed predator Cynnipede wasp. And so the acorn production is very variable between years, and the percentage of attacked acorns is higher when the production is low. Then there is a saturation of herbivores during the mast years. So it does kind of work. Now going to different variability issues. What about insects and their seasonality? Well, in the humid forests, insects usually have overlapping generations, and they are there all the time. Maybe the population densities can change, but typically at any time of the year in a humid forest, you find both larvae and adults of most of the insect species. One long-term study was done by Hank Walda at Barrow Colorado Island, where he had for many years, he had one light rat, which he and his technician were sorting the samples from every night for many years, and specialized on Homoptera. And this is the number of species which were typically recorded a certain number of weeks in the year. And so, as you can see, most of the species were recorded by at least 40 weeks up to 52. And so were there as adults, because that's what light rat is collecting, were there present pretty much continuously. However, there can be a seasonality which is not driven by ecophysiology, but more again using it as a synchronizing signal for population for mating, and that's typical for cicadas. So this is sort of idealized synchronous emergency of cicadas. Cicadas develop for many months or years underground as larvae, and then they tend to emerge at the same time and mate and oviposit and die pretty quickly. So you know that event, you will certainly notice it when you are in the forest, and then suddenly in the space of 1 week you go from generally quiet forests to deafening singing of cicadas of certain species. So they really tend to be very synchronized in their emergency. Well, but generally studying population changes between years for insects in tropical forest can be quite frustrating. This is the study of fruit-feeding butterflies collected at fruit traps in Ecuador over 10 years, and it's very idiosyncratic. Yeah, these are the 10 most common butterflies and how their population fluctuated, and this is the entire butterfly community abundance over 10 years. And after 10 years of study, pretty much the only thing you can say is that populations sometimes go up, sometimes go down, which not really, you can do lots of analysis. This is correlation of community composition with temperature, precipitation, and the community composition. So these are individual months, and then these with 0, this is how the this is how the correlation works with additional months. So for instance, if you want to look at April and how it is correlated with September, which is 5 months later, then you go to +5, and this is the correlation with September. So the hot colors show close correlations, and then the blue colors show negative correlation. So you can look at the autocorrelation of precipitation, temperature, and community composition of butterflies. So you can see some correspondence, especially with precipitation, when you just look visually. You can also see there is a seasonality. So this is the community correlation. Every 12 months, that means the same month of the year, you get increase, you get more similar community, and then over the 10 years, you see slow drift of the mean community correlation. So basically, with the increasing lag in months, community is drifting in species composition somewhere, but the mechanisms and reasons for that are really hard to find. Likewise, this is the longer-term study of Saturniids on Barro Colorado by Yves Passet. This is the phylogeny of the Saturniids collected at Longterm, and then this is the ordination diagram with the pie graph of different subfamilies. This is the color key here, and you can see that basically the population is kind of wandering. If you follow the years 29, 2010, 2011, then go back to 12, and so on. Basically, it's sort of wandering aimlessly in the ordination space. What can we say about that? Likewise, euglossine orchid bees with David Robeek, again, a long time observations at these. They are monitored at sex pheromone mimics. The orchid bees are attracted to these traps, and when you look at 40 years, then total bees are pretty much stable. And when you look at individual bees, we are not going to go species by species, but 15 species are stable, 8 are decreasing, 10 are increasing. I would say the conclusion would be that nothing interesting happened with orchid bees in the past 40 years at Barro Colorado. However, there is a sudden sort of excitement in this otherwise rather unexciting field of study of interannual variation of tropical insects, and that it was sparked by German study using Malay traps in Germany, where they got credible evidence that over more than 10 years there was a massive drop. Actually, it's I should read the title. It's over 27 years, and there is more than 70% decline in the abundance of insects. Pretty much nobody counts insects in these traps, but in Germany they did, and they got this very important and interesting result, and that opened the whole discussion whether we are facing insect apocalypse, and it looks like we do, and whether we are facing it only in the temperate zone, in really heavily agricultural landscape, or also in the tropics. And that's really a big unanswered question, because a recent two years old review showed the data we have available for long-term studies, and you see that it's entirely Europe and United States, with especially the British font of counting insects every year. And so it looks like the analysis show, and I find it credible, that although there might be multiple drivers, then it's pretty much the intensively agricultural landscape we have where insects are reduced. And that, of course, leads to the questions what's happening in the tropics. I would say that in the countryside with heavily oil palm plantations, we know that there are no insects there. So I can perfectly see how the insects decline there. But the more interesting question is what's happening in tropical rainforests. And the problem is that, again, in the tropics, especially where we have so many interesting things to do, nobody is really counting insects. I have been in New Guinea for 25 years, typically 6 months a year. So if I really counted insects all these years, I would have probably known, but we did not. Then Shenzhen and Winnie Halvax have been in Costa Rica in the Guanacaste conservation area much longer, and although they are entomologists and call themselves in this paper insectometers, they don't have a quantitative data. But Shenzhen is one of the prominent voices which actually thinks that insects do decline in at least in Guanacaste in his natural rainforests. And I don't see that in Papua New Guinea, but at the same time, I would not question Dan Jensen's judgment, because very few people know a certain rainforest ecosystem as he does. And so again, he has a qualitative information. He has a sort of casual observations, like he showed these light trapping results. Although single result is not indicative, but he is in a position to say what is typical and what is not. And so you can see here, at least in this series, a clear decline from in the last 20 years. So in conclusion, I think we need to still, the jury is out for the insect Armageddon in the tropics. Dan Jensen thinks it's climate change. In that case, it could be universal. In Europe, it's certainly the degradation of landscape, and that certainly is coming to some tropical areas, but not others. So that's where end our annual and seasonal variability. Thanks for